You won't believe what happened when a greedy HOA thought they could get away with illegally selling my 1,500 acres of land behind my back, and even worse, they believed I wouldn't notice as they profited off my hard-earned property. But let me tell you right now, they had no idea who they were dealing with because I was ready to hit them where it hurt the most. And if you stick with this story until the end, you'll see how I turned their arrogance into their downfall. So don't forget to subscribe. 2 Sham stories for more unbelievable HOA tales that you simply won't hear anywhere else. Now let me tell you how this whole thing began, because it started like a slow trickle before turning into a raging storm. And it all began the day I returned from a long business trip to find out that something didn't look quite right on my land. Sprawling 1,500 acres that had been in my family for generations. And to me it wasn't just dirt and trees, it was legacy, pride, blood, sweat. And the kind of commitment that people who sit behind HOA meeting tables will never understand. But as I walked toward the southern boundary near the lake, I noticed something unusual. Construction stakes, heavy machinery parked, and even survey. Flags marking off spaces that were clearly not part of any agreement I had ever signed. And when I asked one of the workers what was going on, he casually told me that the HOA had commissioned new community lots that would open up for sale near the lakefront. Which immediately made my blood boil because I knew exactly what this was. Theft of the highest order, and not just petty theft, but calculated land grabbing meant to line the pockets of the HOA board members who had been circling around my property like vultures for years, hinting at partnership opportunities or community contributions that I always turned down because I wasn't interested in selling a single square foot of what belonged to me. Yet here they were, bold enough to act like they owned it already. And that was the day I decided that if they thought they could play dirty, I would play smarter, faster, and entirely within the law, because I wasn't about to be outmaneuvered. On my own land, and the first step I took was gathering evidence, walking every inch of that survey line, recording video of the stakes, the bulldozers, the trucks, and the smug workers who believed they were breaking ground for million-dollar lakefront homes, when in reality, they were trespassing on private property. Mine, but I didn't stop there. I went down to the county records office to pull every deed, every plat map, every zoning adjustment, and sure enough, I discovered the fraud. The HOA board had submitted forged documents claiming that a portion of my land was annexed into the association, which not only was impossible without my signature, but was also criminal in nature. And the kicker, they had already started pre-selling some of the lots to wealthy buyers who had no clue. They were being scammed into purchasing stolen land. And that was when I realized the scale of the scheme. We weren't talking about a few dollars here and there. No. The HOA had planned to sell dozens of lakefront parcels at $1 million apiece, adding up to nearly $10 million in projected revenue, all off the back of land that didn't belong to them. And if I hadn't come back when I did, they might have gotten further with it. Maybe even pushed out enough paperwork to tie things up in court for years. But I wasn't going to let them drag me into endless litigation. No. My plan was simpler, smarter, and perfectly legal. Because if they wanted to mess with deeds and sales, I was going to flip the entire game on them. While they celebrated their new community development, I was already in meetings with my attorney, a seasoned bulldog of a man who specialized in property rights and land disputes, and the moment I put the evidence in front of him, his eyes lit up because he saw not just a case, but an opportunity to strike back so decisively that the HOA would regret the day they tried to put their name anywhere near my acres, and together we drafted the counterattack. A legal strategy built on one unshakable truth: the land was mine. The titles were clean, and every dollar they collected from their so-called sales was fraud, which meant I had the power not only to stop them, but to seize every bit of their assets to recover damages. And so, as the HOA board continued throwing their wine-soaked launch parties and boasting to their members about the bright future of their expanded lakeside community, I sat back quietly, watching, recording, preparing, knowing that the day of reckoning was coming sooner than they thought. And while some might have settled for suing them or demanding they back off, I decided to do something bolder, something that would not just end their scam, but crush their entire empire in one move. And that's exactly what I set out to do next. The weeks that followed the courtroom revelations felt like walking through the aftermath of a hurricane, where everything familiar had been turned upside down, but the silence afterward was even louder than the storm itself. Because once the judge had acknowledged that the HOA had acted outside of its authority and hinted heavily that restitution might be demanded, my neighbors, who had once strutted around with a sense of superiority, began slinking around with the hollow stares of people who knew their worlds were collapsing, and I could feel the unease hanging thick in the air as I walked through town, hearing hushed voices that no longer carried the confident cadence of gossip, but instead the nervous murmurs of fear. Because suddenly it wasn't about me being the stubborn landowner anymore, but about them wondering how much their reckless leadership had cost them, how much their blind allegiance to an HOA president who had promised wealth and exclusivity was going to destroy their futures. But while the rumors swirled, I stayed focused on building my case stronger, not for personal revenge, but because I understood something they didn't. Power wasn't just about winning in court once. It was about setting a precedent that would prevent them or any other HOA from trying to do the same thing again, and that meant I couldn't just wait for hearings. I had to dig, so I went back through county records, title chains, tax histories, and zoning ordinances, pulling every thread I could find, and each new document seemed to confirm what I had already suspected, that the HOA leadership, led by their president Marjorie, had gone so far beyond their authority that they had created a house of cards built on fraudulent claims, misfiled paperwork, and outright lies to their own members. My attorney, Robert, could barely hide his enthusiasm when I brought him binders full of the information I had uncovered. And he told me plainly that what I had was no longer just a defense case, but the foundation for a massive countersuit. Because the HOA's attempt to sell my 1,500 acres wasn't merely unlawful, it was a breach so significant that it opened the door for me to target the very foundation of their own property holdings. That was when the idea began to crystallize in my mind. Not as some passing thought, but as a strategy so sharp and unforgiving that it cut right through the fear they had tried to impose on me. Because if they thought they could sell off my land, then why couldn't I expose the tangled mess of how their own mansions around the lake had been funded, structured, and mortgaged, and then legally moved to have those assets liquidated once the fraud was proven? The very thought made me feel a grim satisfaction. Not because I relished destruction, but because justice sometimes required not just standing your ground, but forcing those who tried to strip you of it to taste the consequences of their arrogance. Still, as much as the plan was forming in my mind, there were moments of quiet where I questioned the scale of what I was preparing to do. Because some of those lakefront mansions were owned by families who hadn't been in the room when Marjorie and her board made the decision to target me. People who had simply trusted that their HOA dues and board decisions were being handled properly. Though I could justify every step legally, morally the weight pressed on me. Yet each time I thought of letting it go, I remembered the papers I had found, the fraudulent contracts, the false signatures, the deeds that carried names of people who had been dead for years. It's the arrogant way they had assumed nobody would look too closely, and my doubts hardened back into determination. Because I wasn't the one who had created this mess, I was simply the one willing to clean it up without mercy. So when Robert filed the paperwork to expand our case, not just to invalidate the sale of my 1,500 acres, but to demand restitution equal to the market value of the land that had been tampered with, the HOA board went pale because they knew what that meant. We were putting a $10 million target on the lakefront mansions they all bragged about. And it wasn't just theoretical. It was a very real possibility that if the judgment landed in our favor, the mansions themselves could be seized, sold, and liquidated to satisfy the debt. The shift in the community was almost immediate. Because suddenly neighbors who had once been icy cold toward me now avoided eye contact altogether, afraid that being seen with me might mark them as disloyal to Marjorie, but equally afraid of aligning too closely with the HOA leadership in case my countersuit succeeded. And for the first time since this battle began, I realized the power of silence. Because I didn't have to shout or argue anymore. The facts, the filings, and the fear of financial ruin were speaking louder than anything I could have said. But of course, Marjorie wasn't about to let the board collapse quietly. and she tried every trick in the book to rally support, holding desperate HOA meetings where she insisted that the countersuit was a bluff, sending out letters claiming that the HOA's insurance would cover any liabilities, even going so far as to call me a predator who was taking advantage of a community mistake. But each time she opened her mouth, she seemed to dig the hole deeper because residents started asking questions about why their insurance premiums hadn't changed, why HOA funds seemed to be disappearing, and why nobody had been shown the contracts that had started this mess in the first place. By the time the next hearing approached, the board was fractured, with several members quietly reaching out to Robert behind Marjorie's back, asking if there was a way to shield their families from losing their homes if they cooperated. And, though Robert was cautious, he told them plainly that the law rewards honesty and punishes deception. And if they wanted to protect themselves, they needed to come clean now before the judge forced it out of them in open court. That was the moment I knew the tide had turned fully, because it wasn't just me against an HOA anymore. It was me standing as the gravitational center, while the entire board began to implode under the weight of its own corruption. Yet even with momentum on my side, I never allowed myself to feel invincible, because I had seen how quickly arrogance had destroyed them. And I knew if I let pride blind me, I could fall into the same trap. So I kept my head down, kept digging, and kept preparing for the day when the court would not only clear my name, but give me the authority to reshape the very power structure of that lakefront community. And as I walked the boundary of my 1,500 acres, one quiet evening, the sun setting across the water, I realized that this fight had grown bigger than landed, had become a battle over respect, over integrity, over the principle that nobody, not even the wealthiest residents with the grandest homes, had the right to take what didn't belong to them. And as the shadows stretched long across the field, I knew in my bones that when the dust finally settled, the lakefront wouldn't belong to Marjorie or her board anymore. It would belong to justice, and I was ready to deliver it. By the time the legal war had fully unfolded, the HOA board realized they were fighting a battle on multiple fronts they couldn't possibly win. But instead of surrendering gracefully, they dug in deeper, hiring high-powered lawyers with the Homeowners Association fees, funneling thousands of dollars into a defense that was flimsy at best and destructive at worst. And while they thought this display of arrogance would intimidate me into backing down, all it really did was dig the grave for their credibility a little deeper, because with each new motion filed and each new attempt at stalling, my lawyers and I dismantled their case piece by piece until there was nothing left for them to hide behind. And as the court days rolled forward, witnesses began to emerge. Former HOA board members who had resigned in disgust came forward with damning testimony about secret meetings, fraudulent signatures, and even collusion with local officials to manipulate zoning and property taxes in their favor. And the story spread like wildfire in the local news, catching the attention of investigative journalists who were all too eager to expose the rot festering in the so-called prestigious lakefront community, turning what had once been hailed as a model neighborhood into a scandal-ridden cautionary tale. It was almost surreal watching the tables turn, because only months earlier they had been so smug, sending me letters demanding I give up my land, trying to paint me as the problem, the outsider, the one who needed to be brought into line. But now they were the ones in the hot seat, their carefully polished reputations crumbling under the weight of lies exposed. And their own neighbors, who had once cheered them on, now looked at them with disdain as fees skyrocketed to cover the legal costs, while property values began to sink under the negative publicity. And through it all, I maintained my calm, never once lashing out in anger, because I didn't need to. Facts, the law, and their arrogance were enough to dismantle them. I kept pushing forward with my countersuit, demanding not only the return of my 1,500 acres, but also punitive damages for the fraud. And the court began leaning in my direction, granting discovery access to bank accounts, communications, and meeting notes that revealed even more than I had anticipated. Secret slush funds, under the able deals with developers, and most damning of all, a recorded conversation where Karen herself bragged about how they had manipulated paperwork to make my land sale appear legal, laughing about how that fool will never know what hit him. That recording, once it was played in open court, was the nail in the coffin. And I remember sitting there watching her face go pale, her bravado collapsing as every eye in the courtroom turned to her, the supposed queen of the HOA, suddenly stripped of power and exposed for what she truly was. But the war wasn't over yet, because while the court battles dragged on, I still had my own plans unfolding outside the courthouse, and as part of the settlement strategy. I began reaching out to developers interested in my 1,500 acres, not to sell it outright, but to carve out pieces strategically to maximize its value. Flipping parcels and deals that not only secured my financial future, but also further destabilized the HOA's control of the community because the new owners weren't aligned with their agenda. They were business-minded investors who had no interest in Karen's petty rules or the board's inflated sense of power. Each deal I signed was like a chess move, taking away another piece of their empire. And when the first few developments began construction, the noise, the traffic, and the influx of outsiders sent the HOA into a frenzy. But there was nothing they could do. The land was legally mine, the permits were legitimate, and their grip on the neighborhood was slipping faster than they could tighten it. I made sure the deals were airtight, bringing in environmental impact studies, architectural renderings, and state approvals, so that even their endless complaints to City Hall fell flat because the officials I'm now wary of being implicated in the scandal refused to give them any favors. Watching them unravel was both satisfying and sad in a way, because all of it could have been avoided if they had just left me alone. But instead, their greed and arrogance had led them straight into ruin. The local news continued covering every twist and turn, and soon the HOA was synonymous with corruption in the eyes of the public. Homeowners started pulling out, selling their properties at losses just to escape the mess, and the once coveted Lakefront community became a shell of itself, a place people whispered about but no longer admired. Meanwhile, I was building my own vision for the land, planning not just to develop it, but to create something sustainable, something that would outlast the petty squabbles of egotistical board members, a legacy that would benefit families for generations. And that vision gave me even more drive to push through the final phases of the legal war. The judge, seeing the mounting evidence and the collapse of the HOA's defense, began hinting strongly that a settlement was the only logical path forward. And as their lawyers whispered frantically with the remaining board members, it became clear that the HOA was running out of options, their funds nearly depleted, their allies abandoning them, and their queen, Karen, now facing not just civil liability, but potential criminal charges for fraud. I could see the fear in her eyes each time we crossed paths in the courthouse hallway. The same woman who had once stormed up to me with threats and arrogance, now reduced to a trembling figure, desperately clinging to whatever scraps of power she had left. And in those moments, I knew that the end was near. But I also knew I couldn't afford to let up, not until every last piece of this battle was resolved in my favor. By the time the second week rolled around after the first showdown with the HOA board, I had already begun pulling together every document, every deed, every survey map, and every affidavit of ownership regarding my 1,500 acres. It was a mountain of paperwork, but I treated each sheet as though it were a sword and shield, my weapons to fight a war the HOA thought they could win. Every late night in my study, under the faint glow of the desk lamp, I scoured through county registries and old agreements, making sure there wasn't a single crack in my armor. My land had been passed down through generations, with taxes paid, boundaries marked, and every title updated. Yet, these HOA opportunists had drawn up fraudulent claims suggesting portions of my ranch were common land that could be sold for their so-called community expansion project. What they didn't anticipate was how much deeper I was willing to dig and how much stronger I was prepared to fight. By Wednesday, I had already contacted a state attorney, explaining the situation in detail, and even he was shocked at the scale of their scam. He admitted he'd seen plenty of HOA misconduct, but never something as bold as trying to sell off legally owned private land without notifying or even compensating the actual landholder. His words struck me. This isn't just illegal, it's criminal fraud on a massive scale. That phrase alone ignited my resolve like dry timber catching a flame. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their intimidation tactics. Karen, their president, strutted around the neighborhood as if she owned it, her smug grin never leaving her face as she whispered gossip to every neighbor within earshot. She made it clear to anyone listening that big changes were coming, painting a picture of their lakefront community rising to elite status once my land was integrated. What she didn't realize was that whispers spread both ways, and soon enough, I had half a dozen people secretly feeding me updates about their plans. One man, a retired surveyor who had been forced into silence by threats of fines, dropped off an envelope one evening containing copies of the HOA's fraudulent plats. They had redrawn boundaries, literally cutting through my property lines, erasing decades of legitimate documentation, and labeling areas as undeveloped common acreage. I held the papers in my hands, almost laughing at the audacity. It weren't for the seriousness of their crimes, I might have admired the sheer boldness. Instead of anger, I felt a deeper, colder resolve. They had crossed the line, and I wasn't going to stop until every single one of them faced the consequences. The next few days were a balancing act between gathering evidence and subtly preparing my counterstrike. I didn't want them to catch wind of how much I already knew. So when Karen dropped by my gate with her entourage one morning, wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching her clipboard like it was a royal decree, I greeted her with the calm smile of a man who wasn't rattled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said sweetly, though her eyes betrayed impatience. "If you just join the HOA officially, we can work something out regarding your acreage." Her words sounded rehearsed, like a politician offering favors for compliance. Leaned against the gate, arms crossed, and replied, "Karen, I'll tell you what I told your board. My land is not for sale. Not for your HOA, not for anyone. And if you keep trespassing here with threats and schemes, you'll regret it." The smirk vanished from her lips for just a second, replaced by a flicker of irritation, before she plastered it back on and stormed off with her followers. As I watched her leave, I knew she'd escalate soon. But that was exactly what I needed. Her arrogance was the rope she'd hang herself with. True enough, 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was dressed up in official HOA letterhead signed by Karen and 3 board members, declaring that portions of my land had been transferred into HOA control under the authority of their special counsel. They even included a deadline for me to remove personal property from the so-called common areas. It was so absurd, so outrageous, that I couldn't help but laugh aloud in my kitchen. They actually believed they could fabricate legal authority with enough paper and signatures, as if the state itself would bow to their neighborhood bylaws. But that letter was my golden ticket, was evidence of their attempt to formalize fraud. I scanned it, copied it, and sent it directly to the state attorney handling my case. His reply came back within hours. "This will accelerate everything. Do not respond to them directly. Let us handle this from here." But I couldn't resist setting a little trap of my own. That weekend, the HOA held one of their exclusive lakefront events, complete with catered food and wine glasses tinkling. Under the canopy lights, Karen, as always, was the star of the show, boasting loudly about how the new expansion project would increase property values for everyone involved. Dressed sharply, I decided to pay a visit not as a guest, but as the landlord.
When?
I strolled up the dock and into their little circle, conversations hushed. Karen's face drained of color before she quickly composed herself. "Well, look who decided to join us," she sneered, though her voice cracked slightly. "I hear you've been spreading lies about the association." I pulled a folded copy of their fraudulent letter from my pocket, holding it up like a trophy. "Lies," I said, my voice carrying across the gathering. "Funny because this looks like attempted land theft, and every word of it has already been submitted to the state attorney's office. You people aren't just facing fines, you're facing prison." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some homeowners immediately turned their eyes away, while others looked visibly horrified. The mask slipped from Karen's face entirely as she realized the ground beneath her was crumbling. From that point forward, the HOA began to fracture. Half the members distanced themselves, suddenly claiming they had no knowledge of the fraudulent sales. A few even reached out privately, offering to testify on my behalf if it came to court. But the core leadership, the ones who had signed, The letter dug their heels in, refusing to admit fault, spinning more lies about how I was trying to sabotage the community. It didn't matter. I had all I needed. Over the next week, my lawyer filed preliminary motions to freeze the line, HOA's accounts, while the state attorney launched an investigation. Watching their empire of arrogance unravel was deeply satisfying, but I wasn't done yet. No, my plan was bigger. If they wanted to illegally sell what was mine, then I would legally sell what was theirs. I had just the strategy to make it happen. The key came from an overlooked clause buried deep in the original property agreements for the entire lakeside development. Decades ago, when the land had first been parceled out, my great-grandfather had retained certain landlord rights over the lakefront properties, rights that had never been extinguished because the HOA never bothered to renew or challenge them. They were obscure, hidden in the old registries, but still perfectly valid. Essentially, I was the underlying landholder in every mansion dock, and boathouse on the lake was technically sitting on lease property. That meant I had leverage more than leverage. I had control. The HOA had unknowingly declared war on the very landlord who had the power to dismantle their entire empire. And when I realized this, the full weight of my counterstrike crystallized. If they wanted to strip me of my land illegally, I would legally strip them of theirs. The irony was almost poetic. As I sat on my porch one evening, overlooking the rolling hills that had belonged to my family for generations, I thought about the war still ahead. It wasn't just about me anymore. The HOA had bullied too many people, stolen too much, and crushed too many voices under the weight of their arrogance. Taking them down wasn't just justice for MIT, it was justice for everyone who had ever suffered under their reign. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fire and gold, I made myself a promise. I would not stop until every one of those $10 million lakefront mansions was out of their grasp, legally stripped, away piece by piece, until Karen and her cronies had nothing left but regret. The morning after the HOA's fraudulent meeting had become the talk of the entire town. I was already awake before sunrise, sitting on my porch with a strong cup of coffee, reviewing the stack of evidence I had gathered the night before. The more I read through the forged signatures, the fake filings, and the brazen way the HOA had tried to sell my 1,500 acres, the more my anger boiled, but underneath that fire was a calm determination. These people didn't just overstep. Their boundaries, they tried to erase mine. And now they were about to learn what happens when you push someone who actually knows the law better than you do. I had been a property owner long enough to understand the difference between bluster and binding agreements. Everything they did fell into the category of criminal fraud. The land had been in my family for 3 generations, and no overzealous HOA president or her scheming board was going to walk off with it. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, I was already dressed, documents packed into a folder, and heading into town to visit my attorney Marcus, who had a reputation for being as relentless as a wolf once he caught the scent of wrongdoing. When I arrived at his office, his assistant ushered me in quickly, because Marcus had been waiting for my call ever since I told him the HOA was trying something shady. The moment I laid the papers on his desk, his eyebrows shot up and then narrowed into that expression he got whenever someone thought they were cleverer than the law. They didn't even try to cover their tracks, he muttered, flipping page after page, pointing out not just the fraud, but the fact that they'd actually filed it publicly, as if arrogance itself was their shield. This isn't just civil, you can go criminal with this. We're talking felony fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, since they filed digitally, and possibly even RICO, if we tie it all together with their finances. His words fueled the fire already, burning in me, and I told him exactly what I wanted, not just to defend my land, but to strike so hard they'd regret the day they thought they could bully me. Marcus leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. Then here's what we do. We don't just counterfile, go offensive. Find every financial tie, every personal property they own, and we turn this around. Essentially created a fraudulent shell entity claiming authority over your land. That's grounds to pierce through their entire HOA as an organization. I nodded, and that's when I gave him my ace card. Marcus, I already dug deeper last night. Their HOA doesn't even technically own the parcels where their so-called $10 million mansions sit. They filed those deeds under a defective trust that's invalid in this state. Legally, their titles are built on quicksand. If we push this, I can have claims on their properties before they even realize what hit them. For a moment, Marcus just stared at me, then cracked a smile that spread slowly across his face. "You're more dangerous than I remembered," he said, chuckling. "If that's the route you want to take, then yes, you can not only protect your ranch, you can seize their most valuable assets and sell them lawfully." That was all the confirmation I needed. By the time I left his office, the plan was in motion. We weren't just defending ourselves, we were flipping the entire game. The irony of it made me laugh out loud in my truck. They illegally sold my land, so I was going to legally sell their lakefront mansions. That afternoon, as I drove back past the lake where the glittering mansions stood like trophies for the wealthy elite who thought they were untouchable, I couldn't help but slow down and take it in. Behind those polished gates lived people who believed the HOA protected them. People who probably thought I was some stubborn rancher standing in the way of their perfect neighborhood expansion. What they didn't realize was that their leader had overplayed her hand so badly that I now held the keys to their futures in my filing cabinet. When I pulled into my ranch, a black SUV was parked in the driveway, and I instantly recognized it. It belonged to Sheriff Daniels, a man I had known for years and who didn't take kindly to corruption in his county. Got out and tipped his hat. "Heard through the grapevine the HOA tried something stupid," he said. "But I didn't realize it was this big until I saw the filings." He pulled a manila envelope from under his arm. "They've already come into my office complaining about you, saying you're a troublemaker trying to sabotage their association. What they didn't realize is that I already had copies of what they tried to file against you. I figured you'd want to know they're preparing to escalate, maybe even try to get you arrested under false pretenses." His warning didn't surprise me. Karen and her cronies weren't the type to back off quietly. "Let them try," I said, taking the envelope. "I've got every move documented. They walk into a courtroom, and they'll walk out in handcuffs." The sheriff nodded in approval. "Good, because I'm not about to let them weaponize my department against you. Keep me in the loop, and I'll make sure their little empire doesn't extend to law enforcement." That kind of backing meant everything. It meant their power play stopped at my property line, and no badge in this county would serve their false warrants. Over the next few days, I began executing the plan with Marcus. We filed countersuits, but more importantly, we filed claims on the very properties they thought were safe. The HOA's president, Karen, didn't know yet that her own mansion was technically under my crosshairs, but she would soon. The town buzzed with rumors as news spread that the HOA had bitten off more than it could chew. Some neighbors started calling me directly, nervously asking what was going on. One even confessed, "We never wanted Karen to pull you into this, but she said she could push you off the land and it'll all go away." I told them bluntly, "Her actions are about to cost all of you far more than you realize. When it does, don't blame her signature on the fraud." Still, I wasn't heartless. I had no problem with ordinary neighbors living their lives. My issue was with the corrupt board that thought they could play God over my ranch. But the law was clear. Once their fraud was exposed, everything tied to it was fair game. By the end of the week, Marcus and I had secured the first legal strike. We filed an injunction not only nullifying their fraudulent claim on my land, but freezing the HOA's ability to transfer or sell any property until the case was resolved. That single move hit them harder than any verbal battle ever could. Suddenly, their $10 million mansions weren't liquid assets anymore. They were liabilities, trapped in litigation, with me standing as the claimant. When Karen found out, she stormed up to my ranch in broad daylight, slamming her car door so hard it echoed across the driveway. She marched up, red-faced, and shouted, "You can't do this. Those are our homes. You're a monster." I stood calmly, arms folded. "Karen, I can do this. And the only reason I'm doing it is because you tried to steal from me first. You brought this on yourself." She sputtered, her arrogance cracking into desperation. "We'll fight you in court. We'll bury you in legal fees. and handed her a neatly folded copy of the injunction. Funny thing about burying people in court? You usually need solid ground to stand on. Too bad your HOA is sinking in quicksand. She snatched the papers, stormed off. But I knew from the tremor in her voice that the reality was hitting her. This was no longer a fight she could bluff her way through. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, reviewing the day's victories, I thought about what was still ahead. The war wasn't over. They would throw every ounce of money, influence, and dirty tricks they had at me. But the difference was, I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was turning their empire into rubble, piece by piece, using the very laws they thought shielded them. They wanted my 1,500 acres. They thought they could erase a legacy. Instead, I was about to erase the very ground under their $10 million mansions. And I knew one thing for certain. The next phase would be the turning point. By the time it was over, Karen and her HOA wouldn't just regret crossing me, they'd wish they had never heard my name. The storm between me and the HOA didn't calm down after I started reversing their moves. In fact, the more I exposed them, the more desperate they became to claw back control. But what they didn't realize was that they were fighting someone who now had both the law and leverage on his side. And leverage is something that greedy people like them always underestimate until it's too late. My legal team kept uncovering more fraudulent transactions, more hidden accounts, and more evidence that the HOA board had not only tried to sell my 1,500 acres without my consent, but also misappropriated funds from homeowners. Funneling money into personal accounts and fake shell companies. Every revelation fueled my resolve because I knew these weren't just careless mistakes. They were deliberate crimes, designed to enrich themselves at the expense of the very people they were supposed to represent. While they whispered among themselves and tried to rally homeowners against me, I quietly finalized deals with the investors who were eager to get their hands on prime lakefront property. And when I say finalized, I mean signed, sealed, and delivered. Millions of dollars were already changing hands, and buyers were ready to move in. The beauty of it was that the HOA had no idea these deals were even happening, because while they were busy threatening me with fines and bogus violations, I was selling off their prized mansions they thought were untouchable. The very homes of the board members who had orchestrated this scheme against me, each closing felt like justice being served. Each sale was another nail in the coffin of their arrogance. Of course, when they finally caught wind of what was happening, chaos erupted. I still remember the HOA president, Mark, storming into one of my attorney's offices, red-faced and screaming about illegal sales and property theft. My attorney.com, as ever, slid the paperwork across the desk. Documents signed by the very homeowners who had agreed to the deals once they realized they were about to lose everything because of the HOA's corruption. They weren't angry at me. They were furious with their so-called board. And many of them came forward with testimonies of how they had been pressured, manipulated, and even lied to about where their HOA fees were going. In fact, some of those very homeowners thanked me for stepping in, saying that without my intervention, they would have never known the depth of the corruption until it was too late. That was the breaking point. The HOA was now fractured, its power base crumbling, its members pointing fingers at one another in desperation. They tried to issue cease and desist letters, but my lawyers tore them apart in minutes, filing countersuits that exposed even more of their misconduct. And when they realized they couldn't stop me legally, they turned to intimidation, sudden inspections of my property, so-called safety complaints filed with the county, anonymous threats left in my mailbox. But those petty tactics only proved their desperation, and each time they tried to intimidate me, I documented it and sent it straight to the authorities, who were already investigating them for fraud. What they didn't realize was that by the time they had escalated to these desperate moves, the lakefront mansions were already gone, sold legally, with contracts backed by ironclad deeds and money wired into accounts beyond their reach. Of those homes belonged to board members themselves, and when they returned from their vacation homes or business trips, they found strangers moving in, their locks changed, their titles stripped from them by the very system they thought they had weaponized against me. The look on their faces must have been priceless. Though I wasn't there to see it firsthand, I had my attorneys and deputies oversee the transitions, ensuring everything was above board and legally executed. The local sheriff himself, who had grown tired of the HOA's endless meddling in community affairs, told me privately that watching them squirm was one of the most satisfying things he had seen in his career. And while the board members scrambled to hire their own attorneys, most of the reputable ones in the county refused to take their cases, either because they knew the evidence was stacked against them or because they didn't want to be associated with the scandal that forced the HOA to scrape the bottom of the barrel, hiring shady lawyers who only managed to dig their hole deeper by making wild claims in court that were quickly dismantled. At one hearing, I watched as their attorney tried to argue that the HOA had the inherent right to control all land in the area, regardless of ownership. The judge nearly laughed him out of the room, reminding him that this was America, not some feudal kingdom. By now, the media had caught wind of the story, and local news stations began covering the scandal, running headlines like HOA gone rogue and lakefront power grab backfires. Cameras swarmed the neighborhood, interviewing angry residents who blamed the board for destroying their community's reputation and tanking property values. Every time the HOA tried to spin the narrative, the truth cut through like a blade. Their scheme to steal 1,500 acres had backfired so catastrophically that they were losing their own homes. It was poetic justice, and I wasn't about to let it stop there. I began working on the final phase of my plan, turning the tables completely by not only selling off their assets but also exposing them to criminal charges that would strip them of any power or credibility they had left. The Attorney General's office was already involved, and once I handed over the mountain of evidence, I had gathered fraudulent deeds, falsified minutes from board meetings, hidden bank accounts. It became clear that indictments were only a matter of time. But while the legal system prepared its case, I focused on making sure their financial empire collapsed completely. I reached out to every contractor, landscaper, and service provider they had stiffed over the years, offering them the opportunity to join a class action lawsuit. The HOA had a long history of bullying small businesses refusing to pay for services, while hiding behind legal technicalities, and those businesses jumped at the chance to see them held accountable. With dozens of lawsuits piling up, the HOA's insurance providers began backing out, refusing to cover the mounting claims. Their financial ruin was almost complete, and the homeowners, who had once blindly supported them, now openly called for their resignation, demanding accountability. Yet even as their world crumbled, Karen, the loudest and most entitled of the board members, refused to accept defeat. She marched through the streets with petitions, yelling about how I was destroying the community and ruining their way of life. But the sight of her shouting while moving trucks carted away her neighbors' furniture into homes that no longer belonged to the HOA is a pitiful image of what the once powerful board had become. My work wasn't finished yet, but as I watched their empire collapse from within, I couldn't help but think about how greed always blinds people to reality. They thought they could steal from me and get away with it. Instead, I had turned their own weapons against them, legally and publicly dismantling everything they had built. And the best part was, I still had the upper hand. Because there were more sales lined up, more lawsuits in motion, more evidence ready to drop that would ensure the HOA's downfall wasn't just temporary, it would be permanent, a lesson carved into the history of the community that no amount of spin or intimidation could erase. The courtroom was hushed as I rose from my seat, the final day of the legal battle standing before me like a mountain that had taken months to climb. The only sound was the shuffle of papers and the creak of benches as the HOA. Board members leaned forward with smug expressions, convinced that their money, connections, and lies would crush me. But they had no idea that the mountain was about to crumble beneath them because I had brought more than just lawyers. I had brought truth, proof, and the weight of justice that was ready to crush every false word they had spoken. And when the judge asked me to present my closing argument, I felt every eye on me, the air thick with tension as I spoke about land theft, corruption, intimidation, and greed, laying bare the calculated scheme that had been designed to strip me of my 1,500 acres. While enriching the HOA with their lakefront profits, and I could see the jurors lean forward, their faces tightening as they realized this was not just about one man and his land, but about every homeowner and farmer who had ever been bullied by organizations that believed themselves untouchable. And as I pointed toward the exhibits showing forged signatures, doctored deeds, and illegal transactions, I caught sight of Karen, the HOA president, her painted smile cracking as sweat formed along her hairline because she knew I wasn't just going to win. I was going to annihilate her carefully built empire and drag her reputation into the mud she thought she had buried me in. And when I revealed the final piece of evidence, the emails showing that the HOA board had knowingly authorized the illegal sale of my land and backroom deals, the room erupted in gasps, reporters scribbling frantically as the HOA lawyers scrambled. In panic, demanding objections that the judge quickly overruled, and then the gavel fell, sharp and heavy, as the judge declared that the HOA had acted with willful fraud, ordering not only the return of my land but also punitive damages that reached into the tens of millions, a sum so large that it shattered the HOA's finances and forced them to auction off the very lakefront mansions they had once flaunted as trophies of power. And I watched with grim satisfaction as Karen's face turned ghostly pale, realizing her own home was among the properties on the block, her empire disintegrating in front of everyone, while the world's eyes were fixed on her downfall. And though I thought that moment would be the end, it was only the beginning of the fallout, because news cameras followed me out of the courthouse. Reporters shoving microphones into my face, asking how it felt to bring down an HOA worth $10 million. And I told them the truth. It felt like justice, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been cornered by arrogance and corruption. And the story spread like wildfire across news outlets and social media, turning Karen and her board into national villains, while farmers, landowners, and homeowners from across the country reached out to me, thanking me for standing up when so many had been forced into silence. And though I was exhausted from months of battle, I felt lighter than I had in years, knowing that my 1,500 acres were mine again, and that the legacy my family had built was secure. But it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about showing people that when you are pushed into a corner, when every door seems closed, you can still fight. And sometimes fighting means not just defending what you have, but turning the tables on those who try to break you. And I proved that by legally selling off their lakefront mansions one by one, watching as properties once valued at millions went for pennies on the dollar because their reputations were poisoned. The HOA dissolved in disgrace, and the former board members scattered into obscurity, stripped of their wealth and power, while I stood tall, knowing I had turned their greed into their ruin. And as the last auction closed and I signed the final papers, reclaiming full ownership of every acre they had stolen, I drove back to my ranch. The sun setting across the fields, painting the horizon in fiery golds and reds, and for the first time in a long time I felt peace, hearing the cattle lowing in the distance and the wind brushing through the grass like a promise that my land, my family, and my future were safe. And as I stood on the porch of my ranch house, looking over the expanse of land they had tried to steal, I realized the fight had been worth every sleepless night, every courtroom battle, every painful moment of doubt, because in the end, I hadn't just beaten them, I had destroyed them. Their arrogance had handed me the very weapon I needed to dismantle them piece by piece until there was nothing left but the echo of their greed. A warning to every HOA or corrupt group that thought they could prey on others. And as I smiled into the sunset, I knew my story wasn't just my own, belonged to anyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or bullied. And to anyone listening right now, I'll leave you with this. Never let someone steal what's yours. Never let arrogance go unchallenged, because justice isn't just about the law. It's about standing tall when others want you broken. So if you're ready for more battles like this, more stories of justice served to those who deserve it, make sure you're with me on this journey, because the next story is coming soon and you won't want to miss it. So subscribe to Sham Stories and stand with me as we continue exposing the powerful, dismantling corruption, and proving that no one is too big to fall.